Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the HiFive Live Stepping Towards Christ, 12 Steps in 12 Weeks. Today is step 12, which means this is the conclusion of our series. And for those of you that have joined since week 1, just want to express a gratitude. And this topic is growing in interest on a consistent basis. And I'm so grateful to be the host. My name is Jason Coombs, and step 12 today is having had a spiritual awakening. As the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to other alcoholics and practice these principles in all of our affairs. That's the AA version. And there are other versions as well that I've listed it in the show notes here and the title, but in my opinion and my experience, the 12 steps are the practical application of the atonement of Jesus Christ. And so the first part of this step talks about having had a spiritual awakening as a result of the atonement of Jesus Christ. So there's a promise in there, which means that if we diligently strive to work and live the principles in the first 11 steps, then we are promised a spiritual awakening or a spiritual experience. And that has absolutely been my experience. And then the next part of step 12 talks about the importance of sharing this message or ministering to others. And I'm going to give 2 examples of others who ministered to me and what a difference and impact that made in planting the seeds and cultivating the seeds for my recovery to finally harvest. And then the last part is to practice these principles in all we do or in all of our affairs. And so just want to share 2 quick stories, vignettes, if you will. The first one is, if you watched last week's episode with Dave Pinniger, he was step 11 week, which was prayer and meditation, and he's my best friend. He and I met on our missions in Brazil. I guess that would have been almost 20 years ago. And when Dave and I met, we were instant brothers. We connected right off the bat. When we got home from Brazil and we got into college and started to work and just get going with our lives, we remained dear friends until the day I reached out to him and asked him if he wanted to move up to Salt Lake City and be roommates and go to the University of Utah. And since he is a BYU fan, that was probably a little bit of a stretch for him, but he ended up coming up and became my roommate in college. And we went on a camping trip. And long story short, on that camping trip, both of us fell. Both of us drank, started to use some marijuana. And the end result of that, as we, over the next few years, both of us basically crashed and burned our lives to the ground because of our addictions. And so our relationship started in the light, and our bonds were founded in truth and love and righteousness. And then we spiraled out of control together, and we were actually pretty bad for each other. Negative influences on one another. And then he ended up overdosing, and his wife and son, his oldest son, found him blue, not breathing in his basement. And they were able to get him to the hospital, and Narcan saved his life, and he was able to enter into a treatment program. And in that treatment program, he was reintroduced to God, and he was reintroduced to the truths that he learned throughout his upbringing and on his mission. So after he got sober, and I remained in my addiction for another few years, at the point that I was so bad in my addiction to drugs and alcohol and pornography, and it seemed like everything under the sun I was hooked on. I had severe anxiety and depression, and to the point where my mental illness had escalated to a paranoid psychosis, to where I had audible and visual hallucinations. And I had trapped and barricaded myself in a little apartment that my parents had rented for me. And I had lost my mind. And Dave was the one that I called or texted when I needed to try one more time. And at that time, he answered the call. He responded immediately. He drove down the next morning. He left his house in Idaho around, I think it was 3:30 in the morning or something. Drove down to Salt Lake and came to my aid. And he had been planting seeds of recovery for a while before we actually met up that day. And that's why I reached out to him, is because I felt something when he would talk about recovery, and when he would talk about his journey through the 12 steps and what they did for his life and how they helped him transcend his addiction and patch up his marriage and his relationship with his children. And over the 3 years that he was sober in recovery, he had built a business, and he had moved his family to Idaho, and he was thriving and living the kind of life that I only had dreamed of. And he testified that it all came through the 12 steps and practicing these principles in his life and in his business and in his marriage and in his relationships. And what was powerful about that is when he showed up, I was less than pleasant, he'll tell you, but I still allowed him to guide me, and he guided me into the same treatment center that he went through. And in that experience of working the 12 steps in a protected environment, I was able to reintroduce my life and my heart and my soul to these principles and to my Savior, Jesus Christ. And it was David, it was his 12-step work that blessed my life. He carried the message to me. He passed it along freely and was willing to minister to me in my darkest hour. And through that process, I have been able to transcend my addiction one day at a time. And that is a beautiful, beautiful testimony to have, because I've seen the change in my own heart. Once I got in that treatment center, I remember one Wednesday evening, there was we had a 12-step meeting at the treatment center, and a gentleman by the name of Tim B, he came and he was the speaker. And when he shared a story to the group, I had a hard time like putting the two together, because here was this sharp, groomed man who was a professor and had a family and was apparently thriving and living a life of abundance. And he told his story how just 6 or 7 years prior to that, he was in a paranoid psychosis, and he literally had lost his mind and was living out of sheds and fields, and the police were after him. He had stolen a van and a bus, and he was totally off his rocker in a meth-induced psychosis. And when he was sharing a story, and then he passed his pictures around of what it was like before, and I saw what the 12 steps had done for this man and his soul and his life. It absolutely just blew my mind. And he inspired me that day. He cultivated the belief and the hope inside me that maybe, just maybe, a crazy man like me, who was hopeless, could actually become someone that had a life worth living and could finally be free from the chains. And what was interesting is that he returned again while I was in treatment, and when he returned to come back and minister and to work his 12th step by carrying the message again, I actually pulled him aside and I asked him if he would be willing to be my sponsor and guide me through the 12 steps. And he said, absolutely, I'd be happy to. And so he and I, after I got out of treatment, started working the 12 steps from step 1, and he guided me up through all 12 outside of the treatment setting. And what a powerfully beautiful experience that was. He taught me the most important principle of the 12 steps. He said, Jason, I don't want you to look at the steps as working the steps. I want you to look at the steps as living the steps. Each and every day, they're a practical application of the atonement. They are a design for living. They are a map and a pathway to exaltation. And when I started to look at the 12 steps that way, through his guidance, I began to see that each morning when I hit my knees and I ask the Lord to walk me through the day, and I go out and I try to do good, and I share my message of recovery to you this morning, and when I right my wrongs and I try to be aware of my character defects and surrender all the time when I take my will back, and as I go through all of those principles each and every day, I'm living the steps. And I try to each and every day the best to my ability. And I always fall short, but that's what's so beautiful about the steps, is that they're designed to help those that fall short, which we all do. And so this has taught me how to use that atonement each and every day of my life. And in summary, that final component of step 12 is to practice these principles in all our affairs. And I remember at about a year sober, I decided to go back to school. And if you remember, well, I'll share this. I was terrified. I hadn't been to school in 8 years. And so I had forgotten how to be a student. I was really nervous, felt inadequate, and I decided to go into graduate school, which I felt like I was way in over my head. And so when I started, I realized that these principles apply. Step 1, if you remember, is I can't, and step 2 is he can, and step 3 is I'm going to let him, and I'm going to turn my will and my life over to a higher power, and then I'm going to go through the process of identifying my character defects and offering those defects up in step 6 and 7, and having God remove them one day at a time. And as I went into school and I realized that I can't be a student on my own, like I don't know how to do it, I'm going to need to turn to some outside help. And so I found a school sponsor, they call them tutors, and I started to work with a tutor, and he started to show me how to learn quicker and how to practice the principles in my affairs in school, which was a really beautiful process. And I ended up graduating a couple of years later, and I did fairly well with my grade point average, and the steps worked. The same thing happens in finances. You know, if I can't, I need to find a power that can, and I start to look outside of myself for support, and I found a financial sponsor, or they call them a financial advisor, and I started to lean on them, and they showed me how to practice these principles in my finance. So these principles do work, and I testify that the 12 steps are the practical application of the atonement, and they can take any one of us and transform us into someone brand new. And I can't thank HiFive Live enough for allowing me to work my 12th step on this show. This is what it's all about, is just carrying the message to you and to those that still suffer. And I just want you to know I love you. And thanks for following this show. And if you want to go back and look at past episodes, feel free. They are in the playlist on HiFive Live. And I'll take another 24 and hope to see you on the broad highway of recovery.